Erica Schultz is a comic book writer that has been working for the last 15 years, starting off with independent comic books that she self-published and self-financed, and then working with DC and working with Marvel. When I spoke to her, she had just come back from New York Comic Con, where she was announced as the first female writer to be working on Spawn. She was kind enough to sit down with me to talk about Spider-Man, of course, her run on Hallows Eve, and her new series coming out very soon, Daredevil Gang War. This interview was recorded about a month ago, just before Hallows Eve The Big Night came out, so we don't get to go into spoiler detail on that book, but I've now read it and I can say that it is incredible. It's really good fun. You can find the link to lots of her comics below, including Daredevil Gang War, which was the main thing we're going to talk about and focus this on. So I'd really like to start right at the beginning with your journey into comics, which is quite an interesting one. Were you a comic reader growing up?
Yeah, I was. I had an older brother, and I would basically, grab whatever he got from the spinner rack, and that was usually mid to late 80s. So it was Uncanny with Claremont and Byrne or Claremont Austin, just before Lee jumped on. It was, Spider-Man, Batman, that kind of stuff. Just, normal fare. Nothing really indie, mostly just big two.
And were there any characters that, obviously Uncanny X-Men has so many characters, but did any of them particularly resonate with you?
I always loved Rogue, and then later when he was introduced Gambit, I always thought that they were just like a great couple. And then when the cartoon came out in 92, I thought Jubilee was a great addition. And I know she, from the reading the comics, that she was kind of taking the Kitty Pryde sort of aspect of it. But I thought she was a lot of fun. And I really I just liked the visual storytelling of it, just in general.
From what I understand, you started in more of an advertising role. Is that correct?
Yeah, I started, my first job out of college was at an ad agency in New York. I was an assistant, but I was like, secretary assistant, but I was also an assistant art director and assistant copywriter. And I basically put people's storyboards together and things like that. And after about 2 years of that, they promoted me, and I was like, woohoo, now I can afford my rent. Basically, I was there for a little over 8 years. And then in 2007, around give or take, a bunch of people got laid off because the company got bought by somebody. And that always means layoffs. So I was one of the layoffs. And I freelanced for a bit. And then I ended up reaching out to one of the people who were vendors when I was at the ad agency. They were, this illustration studio that we used to, reach out to do illustrations and comps. And it was Continuity Studios. And they were starting a project. And they said, we need more bodies on this project. There's a lot of work. And that project turned out to be the Astonishing X-Men motion comic. So I started working at Continuity Studios at the end of 2008, and I was there until August of 2016.
And so were you working with Marvel at that point, or was it someone else's job to do all the liaising and the signing off on that side?
No, I was basically just doing the lip sync animation, colors and things like that. I'm trying to think what her actual title was. Chris Stone was the one who was liaising with whether it was Marvel or DC or Valiant or whomever. Chris was the one who had the relationships with people. I was just sort of answering the phone and doing all whether it was inking or digital backgrounds or digital coloring or lettering or whatever. That's what I was working on.
So was all the stuff that you learned there really useful when you moved into physical comics?
Not really. I mean, I would say that doing the motion comics was good because it helped me in terms of boning up on my animation skills and digital skills. But in terms of physical comics, we had been working on a couple of things for DC, and I learned more production and lettering and stuff while doing those. But to be frank, I made contacts there, but none of those contacts helped when I first started, writing my own comics. Bill Sienkiewicz did a cover for me. My first comic was a comic called M3, but Vicente Alcazar, who was the co-creator of that comic, we went around to all the publishers we knew. Nobody would pick up the comic. We still had to do it all on our own. Like, I know a lot of people think, oh, well, you worked at Neil Adams' studio. I'm sure you just, waltzed right into a job at Marvel. It absolutely was not that. So, I mean, I wrote my first comic in 2009. Vicente and I had put out a trade paperback, which was the first 6 issues, the first arc. in 2012. I got that into an editor's hands at Marvel, and I didn't receive a phone call from Marvel until 2014, 2015. So I know people are looking now and seeing all the different things that I'm working on and thinking like, oh, overnight success. Yeah, it's a 15-year overnight success.
Yeah, and it's how prolific you are. Like, obviously, you've had your success now with DC and with Marvel, but we met in London and you were just talking about how many independent graphic novels you were working on.
That nobody was publishing.
Yeah.
Yeah, that I was putting out myself. So, or I was kickstarting, and then somebody came and picked it up, because once it was kickstarted, I mean, it was already done and paid for.
Mm-hmm.
So it's kind of a no-brainer for another publisher to come and pick it up.
So you said that M3 was the first. Was Kickstarter a thing when that first came out? Was that the route that you took?
Kickstarter was around, but it wasn't as ubiquitous as it is right now.
Okay.
Because this was like 2009. So I had cut some deals with some printers to do a very short print run that I could afford to print. I was doing freelance on top of, working 60 hours a week at the studio. I was doing freelance, and basically any extra money that I had, I was funneling into M3, getting it printed, getting it put to, mailed out to publishers. Vicente did all of the artwork on it. I did all of the lettering, all of the production, putting the books together, liaised with any printers. I did pretty much everything else, all the graphic design on the book, because we couldn't afford to hire somebody for that. So I did all of that. And that's basically how I work on every book that I do. I write the script, I have the illustrator, either myself or someone I'm very close with will letter it. And then I do all of the graphic design, all of the putting the book together and things like that, because it helps save money when you're doing all your indie stuff.
And have you found that process get easier over time?
Yes and no. And I'll tell you why. It's because sometimes printers will, like, if you go from one printer to another, like, they will have their mandatories are so specific.
Yep.
So like this one printer, and I'm making up these numbers, but like I went from one printer to a second printer, and the difference was literally like 2 millimeters in what they wanted. And so I had done it the way I had done it before. And I sent the files, and they're like, no, your files aren't cleared for prepress. And I was like, what are you talking about? This is standard American comic book size. Like, this is totally fine. And they're like, no, we need this by this. And I was like, really? You're gonna cut the print by millimeters? Okay, fine. I was like, fine. So I tended to like make different templates and sort of save templates for the various printers that I worked with. This way I knew, like, okay, this one is very persnickety about like the 2-3 extra millimeters that they want. Yeah. This way it's not going to get kicked back, when the file won't get kicked back.
I was also going to ask about comic books in general. Why that medium?
It's a visual medium. And I think that there are some stories that can only be told in comics. I think there are some stories that can only be told in live action. I think there are some stories that can only be told in animation. And then there are stories that can run the gamut of all of those mediums. I love comics because I think that it is the cross-section, or rather the crossroads of literature and pop culture and illustration and art. And I think comics in general is a medium where you can experiment with different types of art styles. Whereas with animation, you have specific art styles that are considered commercial. You have an anime art style, and you have more of a classic art style. Whereas in comics, I think that you can really experiment more. I mean, I always talk about, like, look at what Bill Sienkiewicz did with Moon Knight versus what he did with New Mutants. So it gives you more opportunity to experiment, to sort of push the envelope. I mean, like look at some of I believe it's Mark Teixeira who was doing like painted comics and things like that. Or look at like Asad Rabish, who worked on a bunch of stuff, but also worked on Thor with Jason Aaron. That's, I mean, he's using watercolors, and, which is very different from what we think of comics with like these very harsh black lines. You look at the artwork from Asad Rabish, and there's very like almost like just pencil lines and stuff, and everything's watercolored or gouache and stuff. So I think that it gives you so much more opportunity, but also so much more leeway, because comics are so many different things. If somebody comes out with a fully painted book, or if somebody comes out with a black and white book that's just black and white and zip-a-tone, it's not going to be like, oh, that's weird, because it sort of falls all under the visual umbrella of comics.
And so as a writer, do you find yourself, when you're working with all these different artists with all their different art styles, do you find yourself writing to them and their specific style?
I would say no, simply because when I'm doing an independent project and I'm working with an artist, I will choose an artist whose style will complement the project and will complement what I'm already thinking of and how I'm already thinking of the book. When it comes to commercial work, like working for Marvel, I can give input as to who I would love to work with as an artist, but it's not, I'm not picking artists and saying, I want to work with this person, that person, that person. So sometimes I'll write 2 scripts for a project and I have no clue who the artist is. And then when the art comes back, that's when you have a lettering pass where you look at all the dialogue that was initially written in the first draft of the script, and you tweak it and you move things from one panel to another, or depending on a reaction that the artist drew on someone's face, you might sort of change the dialogue to be either more subdued or sort of more emphatic and things like that. So I wouldn't change my style, my script writing to a particular artist, but I would definitely do a lettering pass that makes sure that whatever is dialogue wise and sound effects wise does gel with the style of artist.
So I'm particularly interested in the writing side of comics. I come from a writing background, and I very recently got a book of Spider-Man scripts from all sorts of different writers, and it was very interesting to see how each of them had a very unique style to them. So I wanted to explore your style a bit. When you're writing your comic scripts, how specific are you? I mean, like when you write a fight scene, are you writing each punch, or are you looser than that? Are you saying these 2 characters fight and this and this and this needs to happen? Like, what works for you?
It depends on the artist. So with Mike Dowling, who I worked on Hallows Eve 1 through 5, and then Hallows Eve, The Big Night, which is coming out October 25th, the one shot. So with Mike Dowling, when it got to issue 2 or 3, and this is, no matter who it is, I will write, I'm going to paste this as a double spread. If you don't want to draw a double spread and you just want to draw 2 single pages, feel free. Feel free to distribute these panels amongst 2 pages, but in my head, I'm doing a double spread. And I always say to the artist, if I write on a page 5 panels, but you can communicate the same information in 4, do it in 4. If you need 6, do it in 6.
Yeah.
It's a matter of just communicating the information properly and at the right point so the pacing makes sense. So with Mike Dowling, when we got to issue, closer to issue 3, I was sort of doing shorthand because I had already gotten into the flow of how I had already seen 2 books, how he was putting them together, how he was interpreting what I was writing. And so I would then sort of shorthand things for him because we had already been on the same page, and we ended up doing 6 issues together. And Mike was a fantastic artist to work with, just really very collaborative and everything, and would say like, hey, what about doing this? To tweak things. And I'm 100% game with that. Some are, I will say this, some younger artists that I've worked with, I've done looser scripts, and they kind of felt as if they needed a tighter script because they kind of, not necessarily they didn't trust themselves, but they started sort of going in one direction that wasn't really sort of following where the story was going. But I mean, I write full script anyway, so I put dialogue and everything in the script. So even if my descriptions for the panels are not super specific, the dialogue and or sound effects that are in there will help inform the description. When it comes to fight sequences, I use, again, just like with the double spreads, I'll say these are suggested choreography for a fight.
Yeah.
If you want to add panels or whatever, that's up to you. Just know we want to make it look like so and so is on the ropes and then they're going to come back. I mean, there is a flow to that sort of storytelling where the heroes getting beaten down and on the ropes, and then has that one moment where they, find the strength within them, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
But, just making the artist aware that, this is the pacing that we're going for.
So you're segueing quite nicely into the next topic I wanted to talk about, which is Hallows Eve. So this was my first introduction to you as a writer, and as somebody who's trying to read every Spider-Man comic ever. Hallows Eve was a nice breath of fresh air. She's one of my favorite new characters in the last couple of years. Seeing her, not only one, does she have a really cool aesthetic, but Spider-Man historically doesn't have a lot of female villains, and so it was very nice and very interesting to have this new character. And then you came along and turned her into more of an anti-hero, and I've got a question about that later. But to start with, how did you get on board with Hallows Eve as a character, Hallows Eve as a project?
The boring answer is that about 2 weeks before New York Comic Con last year, Nick Lowe reached out to me and said, hey, we've got this character coming up that's going to be introduced just before Dark Web, and we would like to do a mini-series. Would you like to work on her?
And how much information did you have at that point, or was it just yeah, let's go for it?
I mean, I knew that she was a character that was introduced back in the early 90s during Clone Conspiracy, or Lost Years, excuse me. When I was brought on, her power set wasn't 100% worked out, but they kind of had it worked out.
Okay.
So Nick and I had these conversations about, was it the masks that were powered, or was it her that was powered? If it was her that was powered, then she could use any mask. If it was the masks, then the masks would work on somebody else.
When he approached you and said, hey, do you want to work on this character? Did he have an idea as to what the theme of the series was going to be? Or was that all you, or was it some combination of the two?
They vaguely knew where they wanted the story to go. And one of the things was that they said, Janine is a bad guy, but she's not a supervillain. She's not a monster. And so that's something that I had to keep in mind. Like, yes, she's done bad things, but there's always a reason behind it.
So one of my favorite parts about Hallows Eve is that she's not a straight monster. She obviously has monstrous powers and she can turn into monsters, but she is straddling the line between good and evil. And the series really kind of deals with how other people see her, and her exploring these other family dynamics that start to kind of explore and explain how she became the person that she did. And then you then brought her back in the Amazing Spider-Man annual as very much a villain, like a sympathetic villain, but still she's going up against our hero Spider-Man, so naturally she falls into more of a villainous place. Without getting into spoilers for Hallows Eve Big Night, if you don't want to, where do you see her ending up or going to in the future? Do you think that she can be redeemed, so that she can become a full hero? Or do you think that she's always going to exist as this sort of half good, half bad, sort of grey area anti-hero?
I think she'll forever be a gray character, simply because she did spend some time in prison, and that in and of itself will inform who you are. She has a consistent mistrust of authority.
Yeah.
So I think that is going to keep her in the gray area.
And that's another interesting element of her. That's one of my favorite moments from very early on in the run, where she's on a bus and she's wearing a police mask, and she starts to see how people respond to her, how people distrust her while she's wearing that mask.
Yeah, there are a few African American students and Latino students on a bus.
Yes.
And they look at her and they look scared, and she's like, why are they afraid of me? And then she's like, I wouldn't hurt them. And then she sort of puts it two and two together. The same mistrust that she has for the police is baked into a person of color, because of the way police usually treat people of color.
Yes. And it was particularly interesting to see, because Marvel's getting better at it now, but Spider-Man's always been a bit pro-cop. Even in one of the most recent video games, he's working with the police, and they have been historically presented as a force for good, when recent events in the world have shown that it's much more nuanced than that, and this series starts to explore that element of the police.
Well, I mean, I think that they've done that too in, especially in Daredevil, the end of Chip Zdarsky and Marco Ciccecco's run. They had shown several members of the police being corrupt, and Detective North being the one who sort of had to, instead of fighting it from within as he tried so hard to do, he ended up having to leave.
Oh, absolutely. And the series also explored the prison industrial complex and really kind of like asked some questions around, is this the best approach to how we treat criminals and how we treat villains, just to lock them away for the rest of their lives, and trying to find an alternative to that? And it doesn't have any kind of hard and fast answers, because is there a hard and fast answer to that question that a comic book can get to? But it was very nice to see that element explored, in the same way that it was really nice to see in Hallows Eve a white person seeing how black people see the police. But I wanted to move on and talk about Spider-Man. Spider-Man featured in the Hallows Eve series in a very cool moment where he punched her mask off.
Because he is strong. I mean, Spider-Man is stronger than your, average bear.
Well, yes, exactly. And you then got to write him in the Amazing Spider-Man annual. So what was it like to write from his perspective, to write, his thoughts and from the more humorous side?
It's funny because I put in some placeholder text because I wanted to be like, quippier and such. And when I first handed it in, one of the things that Nick said was, he flagged one of the lines and he was like, we need to have a quip here. And I was like, I left the placeholder text in. Because that's the thing, is like, I'm very sarcastic, and even though Peter does have this sarcasm, it's never based in cynicism.
Yes.
Whereas my sarcasm is definitely based in cynicism. So I had to kind of, channel the wide-eyed, 14-year-old versus, the cynical 46-year-old.
And I'm guessing because Hallows Eve has that cynicism side to her.
Yeah.
That I guess
Janine was easier to write that way because she would have, because her sarcasm came from a place of a cynic, which was, I'm not going to say that like, oh yeah, I'm Eve. No, not at all. But the idea of like that cynicism, that, that outlook on life, that was easier for me than Peter's enduring sense of hope and his optimism. And it's funny, I said to my husband, I was like, I don't know, Peter just sounds so angry and dour, He's like, sometimes you got to write like somebody else, Eric. It's like, oh yeah, that's right. Forgot, that's part of the job.
But your characters are, from what I've read, like Hallows Eve, there is a cynicism to her and to the story, but it ends in a hopeful place. It ends with her planning to break Ben out of prison. And that hasn't happened yet, but it's still a hopeful place that there is good in the future. And when I saw you in London, I bought Bylines in Blood, read that on the train, and it's fantastic. And she's a very similar character to Hallows Eve. She is cynical about the world and has repeatedly shown that the world is going to work against her and the bad guys are going to win. But again, it ends in a place where she learns that's not the case and that there is a hope to a better future.
Yeah, I have, I always say I'm a hopeful misanthrope. I hate people, but at the same time, there's this tiny little voice inside of me that's like, people aren't so bad, Erica. And I'm like, no, they're always letting us down. So like, I get really disappointed in people's actions. And then it's this giant cycle. I get disappointed in people. I say I hate people, and then the little voice comes in and goes, people aren't so bad. And then you watch something, like on YouTube, where that restores your faith in humanity for I don't know, 90 seconds. And then somebody does something stupid and crazy again. And it's just this constant cycle. That's why I call myself the hopeful misanthrope. Like, I hope humanity is not as terrible as it is, but we're kind of pretty terrible.
Yeah.
I mean, let's be honest. We really are. So, yeah.
Well, I'm glad that if you hate people, that you're speaking to me, because I'm also people. So
it's kind of part of the job, though. It's like, I hate people, but I still have to talk to people.
Yeah.
It's funny because we were just at New York Comic Con and somebody was saying, "Oh, why don't you come out to dinner with us?" And I said, "I don't like socializing." "Oh, shush." I said, "Look, I know you think that I'm a curmudgeon and that this is an act. I'm not. This is not an act. I just want to go home and curl up in a ball and go to sleep. This isn't an act. I don't want to hang out with people." And so they kept calling me Oscar. And I was like, yes, I am Oscar from The Odd Couple, or I am Oscar the Grouch, which I believe was actually named after Oscar from The Odd Couple. Either way, I am happily Oscar the Grouch. Just leave me in my trash can and I'll be okay.
So you obviously got to write her meeting Spider-Man and having a long story about that. But in the future, are there other characters that you'd like her to interact with? Like, obviously, there's Rogue and Gambit that you mentioned earlier, but are there characters in the Marvel Universe that you think she would have particularly fun interactions with?
See, this is the thing, is it's really very tentative, because they more or less, they as in Marvel and editorial, more or less dictates who she can interact with and who she can't.
Yeah.
So she did interact with the X-Men during the Dark Web crossover, because it was, ASM and X-Men.
Yes.
But I don't know if they have in the pipeline this idea of her working with the X-Men again or meeting the X-Men again. As of right now, no one has said that that's the plan. So as of right now, I believe she would more or less stay in sort of the Spidey center of things versus going to the X-Men. And I know the whole thing with Krakoa and all this other stuff and the treehouse, all of that's blown up anyway. So,
but if you had free reign, like if Nick Lowe came to you and said, "You've got one issue, you've got Hallows Eve, and she can be any character," what characters do you think would be interesting for her to meet?
I don't know. I mean, I would be keen for her to be able to finally be happy.
Yeah.
I mean, she's so desperately, like, all she wants is to so desperately be with Ben and vice versa. So if there's somebody who could help her in that endeavor, I think that would be cool. I mean, I've pitched an idea about what happens when Ben gets out of limbo, because Madeline has said, he has to do his time. He will be released when he's done his time, kind of thing. So he's not going to be there forever. The world is going to be a little different when he gets out, or at least in the pitch that I said. Let's see if they greenlight it.
So my last question on the annual, which you can absolutely feel free not to answer, is the story ends with Madeline Pryor casting a spell on Hallows Eve and Spider-Man that bans them from the Limbo Embassy. Now, this feels like it's setting something up. It feels very foreshadowy. Can you speak on that? Is that something we should be paying attention to?
If I'm being 100% honest, I left it open-ended because I was never given, the hard information of, yes, we are going to move back to this, or no, we are going to abandon it. So I left it open-ended, meaning that if, editorial obviously is the one who's pretty much making these decisions.
Yeah.
If they want to go back to it, it's not going to be this like really confusing way of figuring it out, because that sort of exit ramp or rather on ramp again is still there. And
it was a great place to leave it, because as you say, Hallows Eve just wants to get back to Ben, and now the one person that has caused the most harm to that goal is Ben's clone. That it's very interesting that she loves Ben, and the person that she hates is the clone of Ben. That's a nice ironic place to be.
I mean, and that's the interesting thing, I would say, with any of the clones, whether you're talking about Wolverine and Laura, or Laura and Gabby, or, Ben, Kane, and Peter. You're a clone, but you're not the same.
Yeah.
And I think that's something that everybody who's always writing these characters wants people to know. Like, they have their own personality. Whether or not Ben Riley has the formative memories of Uncle Ben and Aunt May, what, quote, grounds him, whether or not he has those things is irrelevant, because even if he didn't, or even if he did, he is still different, Peter. Just like Gabby is different from Laura, and Laura's different from Logan. So I think that that's important. And even Talon is different from Laura. They keep calling her old woman Laura, but even she, I mean, and that's literally like a direct clone, but even she's different from Laura. She has a different perspective.
Hallows Eve is coming back for a brand new story.
Yes.
The pitch for it is basically that Hallows Eve saves some ESU students. So what can you tell us about that story? What are you willing to say before people get the chance to read it?
I will say that she does get to be more hero than anti-hero in this. And I was very, very excited at the way Mike Dowling designed some of the new versions that we see of her.
So will we see her with some new masks? Because it felt like she used all of her masks in the Hallows Eve series. Are we seeing masks?
Oh no. It's when Madeline gave her in ASM 14, when Madeline gave her the satchel, she said it's bottomless. It's an endless bag of masks. So there will always be new masks.
There are two notable masks on the cover. I don't know whether it's a variant cover or not, but there is a Thanos mask and there is a Spider-Man mask. Is that just a cool visual, or is that a tease for what's to come?
I don't know if I can say.
That's fine. We'll keep it as a surprise if that's the case, because I am interested to read it.
Yeah, I don't know if I can actually say.
We'll have to buy it and find out.
Yes.
Great. So we talked a lot up front about how you have had creative projects in a whole range of different areas. You've worked for DC, you've worked for Marvel, and then you've also got your very prolific independent graphic novels. What is it like to work with the big two? To work with pre-established characters in sandboxes that exist. Obviously, Hallows Eve is slightly different because she's a relatively new character, or this interpretation of her. But working with Laura or working with Spider-Man, how does that feel different to working in independent comics?
There's the good and the bad to it. The good is that, you have these characters that already have a backstory, and that their backstory and attitudes and personalities are already fleshed out. So you don't have to work on that. And mostly the world has already been fleshed out for you. Because I feel that there's three ways of building a story. You have your plot, your character, and your world. So 2 out of the 3, when you're working on a character like a Hawkgirl or X-23 or whatever, 2 out of those 3 is already done. At the same time, you have to pitch a story that is within the confines of editorial. And mind you, they know what's happening 18 months out. You don't.
Yeah.
So you might pitch something and say, hey, wouldn't it be great to do X, Y, and Z? And they're like, no, because that's going to conflict with what's happening in 9 months. So the challenge is, without them telling you, because they'll only tell you when you can't do something. So the challenge is navigating what you can and can't do, and then being able to, getting something blessed of what you can do, and then turning around and saying, okay, this is what I can do now. How can I make this even better and even more engaging than, a few sentences on a page?
And you mentioned in an interview, I was doing some research before this, partly because I didn't want to ask you the same questions you've already been asked. You mentioned that you have a story, Forgotten Home, that was based on elements from another story that at the time was unreleased. It was like an anti-Frozen story.
Yes.
Are there ideas that you have for independent comics that have wound up in the sort of big mainstream stories with Laura or with Spider-Man or with Hallows Eve? Are there ideas that you've had there that have ended up somewhere else?
Not necessarily. I mean, there are little snippets that could fit in that world, like the Daredevil annual that I wrote back in 2018. There was a little snippet in that I had actually written originally for a Batman one shot when I was part of the writers workshop. So this idea of the character Misty Knight's partner Carmen, her husband was an EMT and he was killed during a battle between Daredevil and Bullseye. And so that idea of, losing someone to collateral damage, but still having hope for the heroes. So that idea I sort of plucked from that old Batman script that was just a spec script for that class that we took.
So I realize that we're running out of time and I want to get to Daredevil and talk about that in a moment. And obviously that's taking up lots of your time. But are there any independent comic books that you're working on that you're keen to let people know about, keen to shout about that they're going to be happening?
I am currently working on the script for Christabel Volume 2. I don't know what Amagoya Aguirre's schedule is like, so I don't know when she's going to be able to start drawing it. But I am starting to work on that script. And it was announced at New York Comic Con that I will be writing a new Spawn ongoing series called Rat City. So I'm working on that. And I got a few other irons in the fire over at Marvel.
So the big one, and obviously you've just come back from New York Comic Con where this was announced. You are part of the big Gang War series that's coming in the Spider-Man big crossover series. And you're writing Daredevil.
Yes.
And so we spoke when you were over here about how you often work on projects that you're writing them a year out and they were long finished and then they're finally released and you finally get to talk about them. How much of this series is written? How many of the 4 issues that you've got to write is already done?
Yeah, I had actually handed in issue number 4 just before New York, and that was because I just wanted to get it off my plate. But I handed in issue 4 just before New York. Issue 1 is complete. Issue 2 is being inked right now, and Sergio is starting. Just sent layouts for issue 3.
Is it still exciting to you to get those layouts back and get those finished pages back to see those words you've written come back to you from these incredible artists just looking wonderful?
It is. I mean, that's the collaboration part of it. A lot of times people will work in isolation. If I have an artist that I can speak to on a daily basis, great. If I don't, unfortunately, because of time zones or language barriers or whatever, that's fine too. I mean, I always tell the artists that I am, ask any question you need. If there's something that is not making sense, let me know. If there is something that you think will help communicate the story point better, please, let's do it. So I'm very communicative. I know that there are, having been an editor, I know that there are some writers that are like, well, this is what I wrote and that's what it needs to be. I just like, well, it's kind of not the process, but, think however you want. But I really like seeing what the artists come up with, like seeing how they interpret what I wrote. And, I've done that before. I used to teach at the Kubert School, so I would write, a 2 or 3 page script and give it to a class of, 2 different classes of like 15 students each and see how every single one of these students, it's the same exact words on a piece of paper, but every single one of these students interpret it differently.
So when you come to be involved in one of these big crossover projects, you're obviously a piece in a big grander puzzle. How does that collaboration work? Are you getting involved in meetings with Zeb Wells and Nick Lowe and the other writers to kind of paint that big picture? Or are you more siloed and you're told, oh, we need this and we need that to be done in your series?
We had a big Zoom meeting where there was, something ridiculous, like 24 people on it. And we sat down and, this person's writing this character, that person's writing that character. We learned from Zeb what was planned, and it was half and half of half fitting within that, but also the other half trying to do something fresh and interesting and groundbreaking for the particular character. Well, I wasn't allowed to kill anybody, not just because of Elektra making the promise to Matthew, but there's a character in the storyline that I talked about killing. And it was one of these things of, oh, well, we're going to have to talk to so and so and this, that, and the next thing. And I was like, don't even worry about it. They're not going to die. It's more trouble with trying to get approvals than it's worth. I'll write around it, kind of thing. But yeah, I mean, it's a matter of trying to weave your story in and out of all these other stories that are going. And it's a little tough simply because, in terms of continuity, because as I'm writing my story, Elektra will check in with Spider-Man or Luke Cage or whomever. And then I have to email the editor saying, what is Spider-Man or Luke Cage or whomever doing at this particular moment? Like, who are they fighting as this is happening? The other thing is, the gang war crossover series, all the events of it, it's going to go over 4 months, but technically it only happens in 48 hours. So that's like a whole other weird kind of thing. I mean, this is coming out monthly, but the clock is literally only 48 hours. So that's kind of a weird thing, but #comics.
Yeah, I was going to say that Dark Web was a few months, and that took place over one night.
Yeah. Same idea. Yeah.
So my last question, and I appreciate that it's a few months out, so there's not too much that you can say, but is there a moment or a line from this Daredevil run that you're very keen for people to see, that you want to tease ahead of the series' release?
There is a Chaos Agent. There is an assassin who is going to be testing Elektra's promise to Matt, because Elektra promised Matt that she wouldn't kill. And she's there, Matt's off doing his, not sabbatical for lack of a better term, but Matt's doing his own thing. And Elektra made the promise even before they became the king and queen of the Fist. She made the promise that she wouldn't kill. So there is a character that is going to be introduced that is really going to test that.
Okay, that sounds very exciting, and I genuinely can't wait to read it. So I'm going to wrap things up now. I just want to take a moment to say a big thank you. You are, and I said this in an email to you, the very first person that I've interviewed in this kind of way. I've interviewed people for jobs, but never creatives, and never in this world. So thank you for taking a leap with me. Thank you for putting your trust and giving me the time and coming on here and talking about your projects. It is really greatly appreciated. So thank you very much.
You're very welcome.